Her father locked her out with the baby, but the cowboy broke the door for her freedom. The baby's wail cut through the cold morning as the door slammed in her face, the wooden frame shuddering from the force of her father's fury, and she stumbled backward onto the porch, clutching her child so tightly against her chest that her arms trembled. He dragged her across the living room, shouting that she was dead weight, that the baby was a burden he never asked for, and before she could plead or speak or breathe, he shoved them both outside and slammed the lock into place. She pounded the door with the side of her fist, begging, "Papa, please, he's freezing," her voice breaking on every word, but the only response was the scrape of a chair braced against the handle from inside, a final barrier to ensure she stayed out in the biting air. The baby's cries sharpened, tiny fists searching for warmth she couldn't give fast enough, and panic clawed up her spine as her breath fogged in front of her. She had no coat, no blanket, nothing but her own trembling body to shield him. She pressed her forehead to the door, sobbing, "Please, Papa, please!" But the man who had once lifted her onto his shoulders now barked, "Get off my porch! I'm done feeding two mouths!" She staggered back at the words, the cruelty so loud the nearby horses startled in their stalls, and as she turned helplessly toward the empty road, she caught sight of a rider slowing his approach, the dust beneath his boots settling as he swung off his horse with a precision that suggested he'd seen enough before he even reached the steps. The cowboy took in the scene, the locked door, her shaking arms, the baby's shrill cries, the chair wedged visibly under the handle through the window, and his jaw tightened in a way that carried both anger and restraint. "Ma'am," he said quietly, not stepping too close, "was that door locked on you?" She tried to answer, but only a fractured sound escaped, and that was enough for him. He tested the handle once, heard the father shout again, and stepped back only to set his stance, planting his boots like a man preparing for something he wouldn't turn from. She shook her head, whispering, "Don't. He'll only get angrier." But the cowboy glanced at the baby's mottled, cold cheeks, then at the boarded window, and replied in a voice steady enough to silence the wind. "A man who locks out a mother and child already spent all his anger." Then, without waiting for permission, he braced his shoulder, took one deep breath, and slammed himself into the door. The frame cracked. The father shouted. The baby wailed louder, and the cowboy hit it again. The second impact shook the whole porch, rattling the hinges so violently that a few townsfolk across the road lifted their heads, drawn by the noise, and by the time the cowboy stepped back for a third strike, two women and an older ranch hand had already emerged from the mercantile, shading their eyes against the morning light to understand why a man was trying to break into another man's home. Inside, her father bellowed something unintelligible, anger twisted with panic, and shoved harder against the chair he'd wedged beneath the handle, the wood groaning as it fought both him and the cowboy. She clutched her baby tighter, rocking instinctively even though her hands shook so badly she almost dropped him, and the fear that her father might burst through the door with violence instead of retreat flooded her chest like ice. "Sir," the ranch hand called out, jogging closer. "You need help, or is this a feud?" But when his eyes landed on her, barefoot, shivering, baby half wrapped in her apron, and then on the locked door, comprehension settled over his expression like storm clouds gathering. "Ah," he breathed, tone darkening. "So that's what this is?" The cowboy didn't look away from the door. He simply nodded once, muscles tightening as he repositioned his stance. The ranch hand spat into the dirt. "Say no more." Her father, hearing the voices outside, slammed his palm against the inside of the door and shouted, "Mind your own business. This is my house, and I'll do as I please." The words echoed across the yard, sharp enough to draw even more attention. Two teenage boys, a woman carrying laundry, a passing wagon that slowed. The baby's cries ricocheted through the air, something primal and pleading in the sound, and the cowboy's jaw flexed as he glanced back at the growing audience. "Everyone can hear that, child," he said evenly, voice pitched low but strong enough to reach the crowd. "A man loses the right to privacy when he puts a baby out in the cold." Murmurs rose instantly. Agreement, disgust, disbelief, and the pressure of their judgment pressed against the father's defenses more painfully than the blows on the door. Still he roared, "You break that door and I'll—" But he didn't finish, because the cowboy had already thrown himself at the frame again, splintering the wood so loudly that a woman in the crowd gasped and clutched her shawl. She stared at the cowboy's broad shoulders, at the dust shaken loose with every hit, and felt something shift. Not hope, not yet, but the faintest sense that someone was finally standing between her and the man who had stopped seeing her as his daughter long ago. The door sagged inward after the last blow, hanging crooked on one hinge, and the sudden quiet that followed felt heavier than the noise that had drawn the crowd. Only the baby's trembling cries filled the air, thin and aching, while the cowboy straightened slowly, breathing hard but controlled, as if he refused to show fatigue in front of the man who had caused this. Her father appeared in the fractured doorway, face red, hair wild, one hand gripping the broken frame as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. His gaze snapped to her first, accusing, furious, and she instinctively tightened her hold on the baby, stepping back until her shoulders brushed the porch railing. The cowboy didn't move toward the father or toward her. He simply placed himself between them with quiet intention, his back a shield she hadn't known she would lean on. The crowd watched in eerie stillness, breaths held, the tension so sharp it felt like a rope stretched to its breaking point. Her father sneered, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss as he jabbed a finger toward the cowboy. "You think you can stroll onto my land and take what's mine?" The cowboy didn't answer. He didn't even look at the man. His stillness said more than a threat could. The father's eyes darted around, searching for support among the onlookers, but instead he found folded arms, tightened jaws, raised brows. No sympathy, no approval. Shame flickered across his face, quickly smothered by rage. He stepped forward, hand lifting as if to strike her even with the crowd watching, and in that instant the cowboy shifted. Not a large movement, not a dramatic one, just a small, decisive step that placed his body fully between the father and the mother, clutching her child. The father froze mid-motion, the weight of the cowboy's silent warning rooting him to the spot. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "He was gonna hit her. With the baby right there. A man like that shouldn't be raising a dog, let alone a daughter." And the father's shoulders tensed under the pressure of their judgment. She swallowed hard, her breath catching at the stillness beside her. The cowboy hadn't spoken a single word to defend her, yet somehow she felt more protected than she ever had in her father's house. She didn't know what would happen next, didn't know if violence was about to erupt, or if her father would retreat, but she understood one thing with startling clarity. She was no longer standing alone on that porch. Her father's halted swing hung in the air like a stain everyone could see, and the crowd reacted before he did. Soft gasps, sharp whispers, a woman covering her mouth as if witnessing something indecent. Yet no one moved closer, because the tension between the cowboy and the older man felt like a wire stretched tight enough to snap with the slightest provocation. The cowboy didn't raise his hands, didn't square his shoulders, didn't threaten. He simply stood there with a calmness so steady it exposed the father's rage for what it truly was, cowardice dressed as authority. The father's lip curled at the murmurs behind him, and he spit into the dirt, snarling, "She's ungrateful, that's what she is. Doesn't do a damn thing I ask. Thinks that baby is worth more than the roof over her head." His voice cracked, bitterness leaking into every syllable. She flinched at the words, not from surprise but from the familiarity of them. He had said versions of that sentence for months, long before he'd finally locked her out. The cowboy glanced over his shoulder at her, not turning fully, just enough to read her face, to gauge her fear, to silently ask if she wanted him to stay between them. She lowered her eyes instinctively, ashamed of how many times she had taken the blame for a man who never wanted the responsibility of raising her or her child, but the cowboy's presence kept her from folding inward completely. He didn't pity her. He simply stood firm, as though her fear was something he could hold off by will alone. One of the ranch hands called from the crowd, "A real father wouldn't shove a mother and baby into the cold." And the older women murmured their agreement, clutching shawls tighter around their shoulders as the wind carried the baby's thin cries across the yard. Her father spun toward them, shouting, "Stay out of it! She's mine to deal with!" But the sheriff, who had been drawn by the commotion and now stood at the edge of the group, stepped forward with a look that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite shock, more like disappointment in a man he'd probably known most of his life. "She's not property," the sheriff said, voice low but carrying. "And that baby damn sure isn't yours to put out in the cold." The father stiffened as the crowd shifted again, their weight tilting even further away from him. He turned back to the cowboy, pointing a trembling finger at the broad back blocking his path. "Move," he ordered, but the cowboy didn't even blink. His silence was an answer. No. The sheriff's firm words quieted the crowd, but the baby's thin, aching cries still cut through the cold, and the cowboy finally shifted, not to confront the father, but to turn slightly toward her, his voice low enough to reach only her ears as he said, "Let me see him." She hesitated, instinctively tightening her grip as she always had when danger hovered. But something in the steadiness of his posture made her loosen her arms just enough for him to brush the back of his hand near the baby's cheek without touching first. A respectful pause that told her he would not take what she didn't offer. When she nodded, he eased the child into the crook of his arm with a gentleness that contradicted the power he'd used moments earlier to break down the door. The baby whimpered, then settled slightly, fingers curling into the fabric of the cowboy's coat, seeking warmth that her shivering body had failed to give. A hush rippled through the onlookers, men lifting brows, women pressing hands to their chests, because there was something disarming about watching a man who had just splintered a frame cradle a child as if he were holding a sunrise. Her father scoffed. "Oh, look at this, pretending to be some hero." But the bitterness in his voice only exposed his own hollowness, and even he seemed to sense it, shrinking a little as the sheriff took another step forward. The cowboy didn't look at the father. Instead, he reached into his coat with his free hand and pulled out a wool-lined neckerchief, unfolding it with surprising care before draping it around the baby to trap heat against the small, shaking body. She watched, breath caught somewhere between awe and heartbreak, unable to reconcile the brutality she'd lived with inside that house and the quiet competence happening right in front of her. "He's cold," the cowboy murmured, not accusing her, simply stating a truth that landed softly instead of like a blow. She swallowed, blinking hard as shame and relief tangled in her chest. "I tried. Papa wouldn't let me take anything." Her voice broke, and the cowboy shook his head gently, not at her, but at the cruelty she'd been trapped under. "You kept him alive," he said, words stripped of everything except sincerity. "That's more than some could have done." The crowd shifted again, this time with something closer to sympathy than curiosity, and she felt the warmth of it like a blanket she hadn't asked for but needed desperately. Her father spat into the dirt again, muttering, "You're all fools," but the cowboy finally lifted his gaze toward him, not threatening, just unyielding, and said quietly, "A man who puts a child out in the cold is no father at all." The truth of it struck deeper than any blow could have, The father's face reddened at the cowboy's words, but before he could spit another insult, the baby stirred in the cowboy's arms, letting out a soft, trembling whimper that cut through the tension more sharply than any shout. The sound made the cowboy lower his gaze, his features softening in a way that didn't match the strength he'd shown moments earlier. He shifted the baby slightly, supporting the tiny spine with practiced steadiness, and the child's small hand, barely steady, barely warm, lifted and brushed against the cowboy's coat before curling into the fabric. The gesture was tiny, instinctive, wordless, but it rippled across the porch like a declaration. The crowd fell silent. Even the father hesitated, thrown off balance by how naturally the baby gravitated toward the man he'd never seen before. She watched with her breath caught in her throat, hands hovering close to her chest as if afraid to interrupt something sacred. The cowboy glanced at her only briefly, but in that brief moment she felt an entire conversation in the quiet. He trusts me. I won't fail him. She blinked hard, swallowing a knot of emotion that rose too quickly to hide. The father scoffed, trying to regain ground. Babies grab anything warm. That means nothing. But his voice cracked at the end, the weakness behind it exposed like rot under peeling paint. The sheriff folded his arms, unimpressed. Maybe, he said, eyes narrowing, but seems he knows who won't toss him into the cold. The father sputtered, pointing at the cowboy with shaking fury, but no one, absolutely no one, stepped in to support him this time. The cowboy didn't feed the conflict. He looked down at the baby again, adjusting the neckerchief around the child with a tenderness that pulled murmurs from the women in the crowd. And then, in a gesture almost too gentle for someone built like him, he pressed the back of his knuckle to the baby's cheek to check the warmth returning. The child sighed and relaxed. Not fully, not safely yet, but enough that the porch itself seemed to exhale with him. The moment held, suspended, fragile. She felt tears threaten, real ones, the kind she'd swallowed for months, and she turned her face slightly so no one would see, though the cowboy did, and pretended not to. Her father, seeing the attention shift entirely away from him, puffed his chest and barked, "Give me that baby! He's mine to discipline!" But the cowboy finally lifted his head, meeting the father's eyes with a stillness so absolute that it silenced the porch before he even spoke. He's safer where he is. And not a single voice rose to disagree. The father, stung by the crowd's silence and the sheriff's steady gaze, lunged forward with a burst of reckless anger, his hand shooting out not toward the cowboy this time but toward her, as if dragging her back under his control could undo the humiliation gathering around him. She stumbled backward, nearly tripping on the porch step, and the gasp that tore from her throat wasn't fear for herself, but for the baby nestled against the cowboy's chest. The cowboy reacted instantly, not with violence, not with fury, but with a calm, decisive movement that placed his body squarely between her and the older man, his stance widening just enough to anchor himself, without threatening a fight. "Enough," the sheriff warned sharply, stepping forward and pushing the father back by the shoulder. But the man shrugged him off with a growl, desperation turning his movements jittery and unpredictable. "She's my daughter," he shouted, though the word carried no warmth, only possession. "And that's my grandchild." "You put them outside," the cowboy said quietly, his voice so level it cut through the father's rant like a blade. "Whatever claim you think you had ended the moment you turned that lock." Murmurs rose again from the onlookers, agreement, disgust, disbelief, and the father turned on them, gesturing wildly as if their judgment were a physical assault. "You don't know what she's like," he cried, pointing at her with trembling fury. "Ungrateful, disobedient, never listens, never helps." She flinched, shame tightening her chest, though every word was familiar. She had heard variations her entire life. But before the old refrain could bury her again, the cowboy angled his head slightly, addressing her without taking his eyes off the father. "You don't have to stand there and let him talk about you." The simplicity of the statement hit harder than a shout. Her father barked a laugh, derisive and bitter. "Listen to him, will you? Acting like he knows anything about this family?" "I know what I saw," the cowboy interrupted, still calm. "And I know what I broke through to stop." The father stepped forward again, emboldened by sheer stubbornness, but the sheriff grabbed his arm more firmly this time, voice low and edged with finality. "You take one more step toward that girl and I'll haul you in for endangering a child." The crowd shifted, closing subtly around the porch, not hostile but united. No longer spectators, but witnesses ready to testify against cruelty if it continued. The father stiffened, torn between rage and the sudden realization that he no longer held the authority he thought he owned. She stood behind the cowboy, breathing hard, feeling, for the first time in months, something like a path forming that didn't lead back into that house. The father shook free of the sheriff's grip, but didn't advance again. He had finally seen the truth reflected in the faces around him. He was losing, and not just the argument. He was losing the power he had wielded for years. The tension snapped when the father lunged again, this time not toward her, not toward the cowboy, but toward the baby, his arm shooting out with a frantic, dangerous desperation as he shouted, "Give him to me! He's mine!" The crowd cried out in horror, several women gasping, the sheriff cursing under his breath as he tried to shove past two startled onlookers, but the father's movement was wild and fast, fueled by humiliation and the collapsing illusion of his authority. She screamed and reached forward instinctively, hands trembling, but the cowboy reacted before anyone else could, pivoting sharply, turning his body to shield the baby, one arm wrapping protectively around the child, while the other braced against the father's incoming grasp with a single, immovable forearm. The father stumbled backward from the force of the block, more startled than injured, and the porch erupted into chaos as people scrambled to create space, boots scraping, voices rising, fear and outrage blending into one violent heartbeat. The cowboy didn't raise his fist. He didn't tackle the man, but his stance, wide, grounded, commanding, radiated a quiet threat stronger than any punch. "You will not touch this child." The sheriff finally reached them, grabbing the father around the chest and yanking him back so hard the man nearly lost his footing. "That's enough," the sheriff barked, voice cracking with fury. "You just tried to lay hands on an infant. You're done, Sam." The father thrashed, shouting, "He's mine. I have rights. She owes me." But the crowd drowned him out now, their voices rising in condemnation. "You locked out a baby. You almost struck your own daughter. You don't deserve that child." The older ranch hand who'd come earlier stepped onto the porch, face dark with disgust. "Sheriff," he called, "put him in a cell. Any man who grabs at a baby like that shouldn't be left roaming free." The sheriff didn't hesitate. He wrestled the father's hands behind his back, slapped iron cuffs onto his wrists, and shoved him down the steps while the man sputtered, cursed, and finally broke into a raw, pitiful sob of frustration. She stood frozen, hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Not from sorrow, but from the shock of witnessing someone stopping the violence she had endured for so long. The cowboy, breathing hard but steady, loosened his protective hold only after the father had been dragged off the porch. Then he turned to her slowly, checking the baby first with a careful sweep of his thumb along the child's cheek. The baby clung to him, still whimpering but safe, warm, protected. And the crowd, who earlier had come only out of curiosity, now watched with something far deeper. The understanding that they had just witnessed a man stand between injustice and innocence, with nothing but his body and his unshakable will. The sheriff dragged the father across the yard toward the waiting wagon, but the crowd didn't follow. They stayed gathered around the porch, their attention fixed on the mother, the baby, and the cowboy, who still held the child with a steadiness that quieted the last of the infant's sobs. The murmurs shifted now, no longer gossip or shock, but something heavier, more reflective, as people reckoned with the truth they had just witnessed. An older woman stepped forward first, clutching her shawl tightly as she approached the mother with trembling sympathy. "Honey, you don't go back in that house, you hear?" she said, voice low but firm. "A door that shuts on a baby ain't a home." Others nodded. Storekeepers, ranch hands, a pair of teenagers who'd once snickered at her behind the church steps. Each expression softened now, chastened by the cruelty they had seen and the courage they hadn't expected. The sheriff returned, dusting off his hands, face carved with a seriousness that replaced even the smallest hint of neutrality. "Sam'll spend the night in the cell," he said, meeting her eyes directly. "And tomorrow, we'll talk about charges. You won't have to stand alone in this." She swallowed, unsure how to respond, overwhelmed by the sudden shift from isolation to support. The cowboy stepped closer, not intrusive, not assuming authority, just enough that she could see the question in his quiet gaze. "Do you want the baby back, or do you need a moment to breathe?" She reached out hesitantly, fingers brushing the baby's back, but when the child curled tighter against the cowboy's chest, she pulled in a shaky breath rather than forcing a transfer. The cowboy adjusted his hold instinctively, not claiming the child, simply following the baby's need for warmth and steadiness. A man from the livery yard called out, "Cowboy didn't have to break that door, but thank the Lord he did." And several people murmured agreement, their approval forming a kind of protective circle around the small family the father had tried so brutally to fracture. The sheriff nodded toward the shattered doorway. "We'll get that boarded up. No one expects you to step back inside unless you choose to." She looked at the ruined door, splintered where the cowboy's shoulder had struck, hanging crooked, no longer an entrance but a monument to the moment her life had split open. She inhaled slowly, her eyes lifting toward the cowboy who had shielded her without hesitation, held her child without fear, stood against her father without raising his voice. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking but steady enough that everyone heard. The cowboy didn't bow, didn't shift awkwardly, didn't brush off her gratitude. He simply nodded once, a quiet, deliberate gesture that felt like the final verdict the entire town had been waiting for. The crowd thinned slowly, as though none of them wanted to be the first to step away from the moment they had helped witness, leaving the porch quiet except for the soft creak of the broken door leaning against its splintered frame and the baby's tired breaths against the cowboy's coat. She stood a few feet away, arms wrapped around herself, not from cold now, but from the unfamiliar emptiness where fear had lived for so long. The sheriff paused at the gate before leaving, giving her a small nod that carried both apology and promise. "We'll talk tomorrow," he said gently. "But tonight, you rest somewhere safe." When he walked off, the yard fell into a stillness she hadn't felt in years. Not the tense quiet of waiting for her father's temper, but a calm that allowed her lungs to finally fill without shaking. The cowboy shifted the sleeping baby carefully, making sure the wool-lined cloth hadn't slipped, and then turned to her, not with expectation, not with possession, but with a steady patience that asked her to choose the pace of the next steps. She reached out, hesitating only once, before sliding her hands around her child. The baby stirred but didn't cry, settling easily into her arms again, warmed and steadied by the man who had carried him through the storm that morning. I don't know where to go," she admitted, voice low, eyes dropping to the porch boards. She expected pity, or a quick solution, or an offer she wasn't ready to accept. But the cowboy simply nodded, as though uncertainty was a normal place to begin. "You don't have to decide tonight," he said quietly. "The Widow Harrow keeps rooms. My horse could take you there, or I can walk beside you if you prefer." He didn't step closer. He left space, real space, for her to breathe, to think, to exist without pressure. She looked toward the road leading out of the yard, the evening sun dipping low enough to paint the dust in soft gold, and she exhaled a breath that felt heavier leaving her body than it ever had entering. "Walking would be nice," she whispered. The cowboy nodded again, gentle as a sunrise, and stepped off the porch, pausing until she moved first. She followed slowly, the baby bundled against her, each step lightening something inside her that she'd once believed would never lift. And as the three of them walked down the quiet road, her leading, the cowboy a respectful half-step behind, she felt, for the first time in her life, that freedom wasn't a door breaking open behind her. It was simply choosing a path where no one could lock her out again. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on Stories Left Behind. If you heard a baby crying behind a locked door, would you break it open like the cowboy did or walk away? Tell us in the comments.